Hi, this is Oriel again with Faith on Fire. A couple of years ago, I was living in Arklow and it was the height of the recession. And I remember a very sad situation happened around the corner from us. There was a man who, like a lot of builders in the country, was out of work at the time and he was unable to pay his mortgage. So the bank foreclosed on the house and told him he had to move out. Well, he took matters into his own hand and he parked a big Caterpillar digger out in front of his house. And he told the bank he wasn't moving, that it was his house. You know, it's an awful situation to be in when you have a debt that you are not able to pay. I was reading in the Bible recently, and I read a story that Jesus told about a man who was in a situation like that. And you can read it for yourself in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 through 35. Well, the story goes there was an employer in Roman times, and he was in business. He had people working for him. And as the accountant was going over the books, they discovered that one of his employees owed him a lot of money. In those days, they would have called it 10,000 talents. And it was a lot of money. A talent is about 58 to 80 pounds of gold. So it's a lot of currency. And they found that this man owed the money. So the employer calls his employee in and says, "You owe me this debt, these 10,000 talents of gold, and you need to repay it." Well, the man is obviously completely unable to pay it. Just to put it in perspective, an ounce of gold today, I checked today, trades at 1,580 euros and 8 cents. If you multiply that out, and that's for 1 ounce. If you multiply that out, assuming that a talent is 58 pounds, which is on the low end, that would equal to 14,663,142,400 euros. That is a lot of money. I would hate to owe somebody almost 15 billion euros because there's no hope that I'd be able to pay it. Well, that's how this man this was the situation in which this man found himself. He had a wife and kids. He was working an ordinary job, and there was just no way he was going to be able to pay it. Well, the story continues on as Jesus tells it. The man falls down on his face before his employer, and he says, "Please be patient with me, and I will pay you everything that I owe you." Now, in reality, that is totally implausible. He's never going to be able to pay back a debt of that size. Now, Jesus is telling this story to give us a picture of being saved, of being forgiven, and we will talk about that in a minute. But what happens in the story is the master looks at him, the employer, he looks at this employee, he recognizes he won't be able to pay the debt, and he just forgives him the debt. He cancels the debt. He says, "You don't actually owe me anything anymore." Okay? And it's very sad because the story goes on to say that this employee, he goes out having been forgiven almost 15 billion euros, and he finds another employee, we assume it's of the same employer, and this other employee owes him 100 denarii. Now, a denarius was a silver Roman coin, and it was equal to about a day's wage. And so in today's terms, you know, in Ireland, the average daily wage would be about 184 euros. And so when you multiply that out, we're talking about a debt of about 18,456 euros. So, you know, it's a significant amount, but not nearly as much as the almost 15 billion that the first servant, the first employee owes the employer. Well, the first employee goes out and finds the second employee, takes him by the throat and says, "You need to pay me that 18 grand. And when the second employee is not able to pay, the first employee takes him, brings him to prison, and orders that he be held until he pays everything. Now, you know, in those days, prison was not, prison's not a nice place to be in our day and age. It was considerably worse for a debtor who had defaulted on his debts back in the first century in the Roman Empire. Basically, if a person owed a debt they couldn't pay, they could legally be committed to the jail, to the prison, and those that kept the prison would torture that person in various ways. And there were laws to what they could and couldn't do, but they were allowed to torture that person. So, if that person had any money, they would be strongly encouraged to use that money to pay the debt. Or alternatively, that their friends and family would see them undergoing this suffering and would then pay that debt for their relative or their friend so that they could be released from prison. And so it was an awful thing. It was a very cruel thing. And so this first employee, he actually commits the second employee to prison. Okay. Now, when the other employees hear about this, they hear about what this guy has done, and they see this happening. They go and they tell the employer, the guy, the boss, the guy that owns the business, whom the first servant owes almost 15 billion euros. Well, they go back and tell him, and he's very saddened when he hears this. And in fact, he calls that first employee to him again, and he says, "Look, what are you doing?" And in the end, what he does is he actually delivers that first servant to the prison. Because having been shown great mercy, that first employee goes out and shows absolutely no mercy to someone who owed him a much smaller debt. Now, let me ask you, doesn't it hurt when somebody treats you in a way that's not right? They don't treat you right. They treat you in a way you don't deserve. We often resent it when somebody treats us in a way that falls short of society's norms. That's why we have laws. If somebody beats you up or just viciously verbally abuses you, that bothers us. We resent that. We particularly resent it when we try to do somebody good and then they turn around and do us bad. They betray us. Maybe we try to help somebody and then they turn around and take advantage of us. I think that's how the employer felt in the story. He forgives this employee this sizable debt that he's never going to be able to pay. And then the same employee goes out and is very exacting and merciless to another employee who owes him so much less money, such a great amount less. Now, this is an illustration for us that Jesus is giving us of forgiveness. It's in answer to the question from Peter, how many times should we forgive people? And Jesus goes on to explain that if we've been forgiven a lot by God, we should be forgiving people. In other words, the forgiven should be the most forgiving people on the planet. But I want to draw your attention to the analogy that Jesus draws because it is so powerful. It just stuck me to the floor when I read it. Of course, the employer is a picture of God, okay? And the debt that is owed is a picture of the fact that we owe God. We owe him a debt. Now think about it. The idea is that while the employer treated the employee very well, he went out and he treated somebody else very bad. Now think about it. 100 denarii or 18 grand, that's about the worst that people can do to us. And I understand people can treat us bad in very serious ways. And I've seen that through my life, particularly as I've helped others and tried to counsel them as a pastor. But, if how others have treated us and the worst they can do us is represented in the story by 100 denarii or 18 grand, and the wrongs that we have done to God, remember the employer is a picture of God, is represented by 10,000 talents of gold, or at a conservative estimate, almost 15 billion euros. How bad have we treated God? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. How bad have you and I treated God? Well, think about it. He's God. He's our creator. Do we treat him like God? Do we treat him like our king? God has a right to expect that we would turn to him in difficulty and that we would worship him in our lives. But how often as human beings we turn to other things and other people, especially when we're in difficulty. And God says, I'm your God. You know, he's the giver of all good things. It says in James, all good things come from God, who there's no shadow of turning in him. There's no variableness, and every good gift comes from him. But you know, how often do we thank him for the good things in our life? How often do we say, we recognize that that blessing came from God and say thank you? You know, God has the right to tell us what to do. If he created us, and the Bible teaches us that he did, then he has the right to tell us what to do. But do we obey him? Now, we've got to talk about sin for a minute to understand this. You know, God is not some old white-haired man with a long beard sitting up in the sky trying to dream up crazy rules to make our lives miserable, okay? He's not. But he does have things that he says are right and things that he says are wrong. But we need to recognize that those things that he said, those rules, those principles, if you like, in the Bible, are not something alien to God. They are a representation of who God is. You know, God tells us in the Ten Commandments, don't lie. You know, God himself is incapable of lying. He is the most truthful person you could ever meet. You know, God also says in the Ten Commandments, don't commit adultery. You know, that a person who is married is supposed to be faithful physically to the person they're married to. But you know what? That's a reflection of who God is. In other words, God is loyal to those he loves. God is exclusively committed to those he loves, and he gives them exclusive right to himself. And also, God says in the Ten Commandments, honor your father and your mother. You know, when Jesus Christ lived on earth, he honored and obeyed Joseph and Mary. And you know what? He was God. But he submitted to them because he recognized that his heavenly Father had put his earthly father and mother in his life, and he needed to listen to them and do what they asked him to do. Again, God is not up in the sky making crazy rules to make our life miserable. No, these rules that he's given us are a reflection of who he is.